Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Malissa Clark. Melissa is the Associate Professor of Industrial Organizational Psychology at the University of Georgia and Director of the Healthy Work Lab. She's also the author of Never Not Working, Why the Always-On Culture is Bad for Business and How to Fix It. And that is what we talk about. It is a fantastic book, and we go pretty deep into it. We talk about the concept of workaholism. What does it mean to be a workaholic? What are the physical implications of being a workaholic over time? How does it impact our health? How does it impact our relationships? As somebody who is an achiever, who likes to do a variety of things, who finds it hard to shut those things off and enjoy moment in the present, this was a little bit of a therapy session for me, as I imagine it will be for a lot of folks who listen to this. It just seems like our culture right now has created, I don't know whether you call it hustle culture or anything else. It's just created this sense that if you are not getting ahead, you're falling behind. And that comes with all kinds of stress, guilt, anxiety that causes us to be plugged in all the time. And when we're not plugged in, it causes us to be feeling all kinds of negative emotions about it. I think this is a very important episode, whether you are somebody who struggles with this yourself or whether you are leading a team, because I guarantee there are people on that team who are struggling with this. If we want to make a change, if we want to be productive, but in a healthy, human-centric way, I think it's conversations like this and changes that we make in ourselves that are going to make that better. My rant over. Here is Malissa Clark.
Melissa, welcome to the show. I am really interested to dive into this topic, and I will do my best not to turn it into a personal therapy session, but we're here to talk about your new book and to talk about workaholism. Workaholism? Am I saying that right?
That's how I pronounce it. Yeah, workaholism. Thank you so much for having me.
How did you come to study workaholism and create this book?
Yeah, so this book was a lot of me search. I definitely I didn't know the term when I was little, but I've always felt like I always needed to be doing stuff, picking up more opportunities. And this goes all the way back to elementary school, joining every club, playing all the sports, and just kind of continued. In high school, I was doing everything. And, in addition to taking AP classes and all of that, doing stuff that I don't think that many college students would do, for example, taking a summer job, selling books door to door, working 80 hours a week doing this job, just, going all the time, taking on more and more. And so I definitely feel like I've struggled with workaholism. I became a professor, and one of the things that I thought, well, I might as well study this because I can relate to it is, why don't I understand this phenomenon that I've been feeling, my whole life? And so, yeah, I just dove in and have been studying it for the last 15 years.
How do you define it?
Okay, so I think a lot of people, when they hear the term, kind of dismiss it as kind of a jokey term, not quote unquote real science, but there's actually a lot of science behind workaholism. And the way that scholars define it is it's more than just working long hours, although that's part of it, right? So spending, more time than is necessary to do your job, doing things like taking work on vacations with you. Sure, that's all part of it. That's part of the long work hours component, but there's more. There's some additional factors that exacerbate some of the negative outcomes that we're going to talk about. There's a motivational component where you're feeling like you ought to be working all the time, that you should be working. Maybe you don't really know why, but you just feel it in the pit of your stomach. There's also the cognitive component where you're thinking about work all the time and you can't shut it off, that you're ruminating about work. Then there's the emotional component where, along with that pit in your stomach, you probably feel anxious or guilty or frustrated that you can't finish something because you're distracted by, God forbid, your family. And so it's multidimensional. There's, different components to it. But I define it as, an unhealthy way of working that involves working too much, but also working compulsively.
Yeah. So I wanted to pull a quote from the book. And I don't think I mentioned the title before, but for anyone interested, the book is called Never Not Working, which is a great title. And I wanted to pull this. I'm not saying that hard work is bad or that all hard work is workaholism. I'm saying that we need this book now because our relationship with work is becoming increasingly unhealthy. Levels of stress and burnout are at an all-time high. And I think that that's interesting. And I'll be vulnerable and share that I read that passage at 1:00 in the morning in the ER. So,
oh no.
My 4-year-old son, almost 5-year-old son, had some stomach issues over the course of a couple of weeks. And my father-in-law, who's a gastroenterologist, was like, you should go. It got bad one night. He had a fever, and it was like, you should go to the hospital because we just need to make sure it's not appendicitis. So my wife took him to the hospital in the afternoon. Then she called me and was like, hey, we're going to be here late. They're doing some more tests. You should come down. So I go down at about 10:00 at night. We're there. Everybody's tired. My son falls asleep, around midnight to get some rest between tests. My wife, who's exhausted, kind of closes her eyes, and I'm sitting there, and it's our holiday break. I have 2 podcast related books I need to get through. I've gotten through one. Yours was the second one. And I was like, well, I got nothing else to do. I'll just pick this up and do it. And then I'm reading that, and I was like, damn, she got me. And
how ironic,
and I was, and I was like, man, the irony of this is insane that I'm sitting here with my son in the hospital. And now granted, I wasn't like missing his test. I mean, he was asleep. Right, we were waiting. I put the book away when they came back in, but it was interesting to sit there in that moment and think like, man, I am really cramming work into every possible hour. Now I enjoy it. I loved your book. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
But at the same time, it was also work.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of other things you could be doing. You could be listening to a fun podcast. You could be reading a fiction book,
Yeah.
Or, closing your eyes and sleeping. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a hospital story I talk about in the book too, so I can relate. Yeah. Guilty as charged.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want me to elaborate, but I certainly can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to that exact point, I was in graduate school. I had both of my kids in graduate school. I was taking a class. Well, I was taking a full load of classes and also teaching a class as instructor. And my daughter was due right in the middle of the semester. And it was right before spring break. It was the Friday before spring break. And I had a midterm that I was trying to finish. I was in a coffee shop. And all of a sudden, I started having contractions. And I am just, instead of being excited, like, oh my gosh, I'm about to have my first kid ever. No, I was frantic. And I was like, oh, how am I going to finish this midterm before I have my baby? I need like probably 24 hours more of time to work on this. So I stayed at the coffee shop for a couple hours in labor, timing my contractions. And I was like, they're not close enough. They're kind of sporadic, until it got to the point where I was like, I can't focus. They're kind of a little bit too painful right now. So I left, had her, but I brought my computer, and this is not in the book either, but I brought my computer to the hospital. And in between guests, I should have been napping. What did I do? I pulled out my computer and I was working on that midterm, just feeling like I could not stop. And that wasn't quote unquote work. That was school. But I mean, grad school is a full-time job pretty much. So It just, I don't know why. It just didn't really cross my mind that I was allowed to take a break for my personal life. I didn't even ask for an extension. I was just like, I need to prove I'm a good graduate student.
Yeah.
So,
well, and to your point about it wasn't even work. I think about that with me, and that was what hit me with the book was, I have a pretty demanding job. It's a sales job. It's very growth oriented. You have to outperform yourself every year. So there is a lot of pressure there.
Oh, absolutely.
But then,
I did sales. Yeah, I can relate.
Yeah. I also tend to be an overextender, and I tend to procrastinate with major projects. So I will take on a major project to avoid completing a major project. And, I have a podcast. I released a children's book last year. I am into my own kind of health and fitness and work out a certain amount of days a week. And the only time I can do it is in the morning. So I'm getting up early. People hear that, and I often get sort of a look of like, oh my gosh, how do you do it all? That's so great. And it is great in so many ways. And yet it is also exhausting in so many ways and unhealthy in certain ways. And so how much of workaholism is having your job and never leaving your job? And how much of it is just stressing yourself out with commitments and projects? Are they the same thing? Or are they different? I was curious about how you think about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it's kind of both. I do think with workaholism, there are some personality traits and characteristics that tend to be linked to, once someone gets into the workforce, they do tend to have this unhealthy relationship with work, things like perfectionism, type A personality. So the go-getters, right? People like you and me that seek out sales jobs and, these really demanding careers. It's partly this negative relationship we have with work, but it's also, I talk to a lot of individuals that are part of Workaholics Anonymous and interview them for the book. And a lot of people describe it as almost like an addiction to busyness. That is not really specific to work, but there is a way to be, negatively tied to your work specifically. And this admiration that you just mentioned about, oh, look at all the things you've done. You've accomplished so much. You're so great. It's almost like the things you accomplish work-wise are part of your identity now. And that's admired by society. And it's a great thing. Don't get me wrong. I strive to be successful too in my career. But yeah, I think just acknowledging that anything can be taken too far, including your work. Anything that's interfering with your life and your other goals and passions can be detrimental.
Yeah. I was going to hold this for the end, but maybe we bring it up now. And I want to talk about the actual impacts of workaholism on your body and your relationships and that kind of a thing. But if anybody's listening to this up to this point and is starting to check out, yeah, that's great. I can't process that. I got too much to do. Want to talk about some of the, I don't know, call it devil's advocate or hesitancy, things that popped into my head as I was reading this that I'm sure there are other people who are thinking this too. But the one is, well, hey, achievement takes sacrifice. If we want to achieve something great, it takes sacrifice. It takes hard work. Look at Tiger Woods or Tom Brady or Michael Jordan. They were completely obsessed. And if we want to be the best, we have to be obsessed. We have to be workaholics. Mm-hmm. Would love any response you have to that kind of thinking.
Well, to what end? Again, it's something that I struggle with too, wanting to be successful. But also, I have things that are really important to me. Probably the most important being my kids, right? And I know you said you have a son, and my kids are my world. And it's when I realize that my work passions are potentially interfering with my relationship with them and bonds that I'm building with them now that I'm hoping will carry forward so we have a good relationship when they become adults. Both my kids are in high school now. It's hard to believe, but just thinking back to when they were little and all the time that I was spending when I was in graduate school, really overextending myself way too much and not prioritizing that time with them. It is a big regret I have that I didn't allow more time with them. I'm very proud of everything I've accomplished. But at the same time, I recognize that I had to sacrifice. And yeah, I guess to what ends? Yes, we can be all super successful, but if everything else in your life falls apart, then is it really worth it?
Yeah. I think that's a good point. If you have something specific and big that you're driving toward, that's great. But most people don't. Like most people are not in the category to become the best basketball player in the world or the best football player in the world or whatever. And to try, not that we shouldn't try and achieve our dreams or anything like that. I'm all about that. But we do have to be honest about what our goal really is. I think that goes to an interesting point. You talked about introjected motivation in the book. Can you explain what that is? I feel like that's tied into what we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. So introjected motivation comes from a theory in psychology called self-determination theory. And it's really that you are motivated to do something because of partially internalized values. This could be something put onto you by society that we then partially think that this is the way things should be. And the way it manifests is that we, in the workplace specifically, is that we work because we feel like we ought to, because we feel like we should. And that is that kind of pit in your stomach type of feeling that drives workaholism. You mentioned earlier that you enjoy your work. I do too, right? A lot of people probably do that also may identify as workaholics. And that type of motivation to work, to be an engaged worker is intrinsic motivation. And so instead of feeling compelled to work with intrinsic motivation, you work because you enjoy it. It's possible to have both things happening at the same time. It's not as simple as I either am a workaholic or I'm an engaged worker. I'm driven because of this introjected motivation or intrinsic motivation. It could be both. And I would argue that probably a lot of people that are successful business people probably do love their work, but they may also feel like they ought to be working, this compulsion. And so the tricky thing is intrinsic motivation has been linked to a lot of positive outcomes, performance, creativity, all the things that organizations want. But introjected motivation has been linked to basically the opposite, a whole bunch of negative outcomes, not just with personal outcomes, but also work-related outcomes. Introjected motivation is not linked to performance, and it oftentimes is negatively linked to performance. And so while you have the good things coming from being intrinsically motivated, you also have at the same time these negative outcomes driven by your introjected motivation. And some of the research shows that all the positive effects of being, intrinsically motivated to work can be washed out if you also are having introjected motivation to work as well. So,
wow,
it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's important to talk about because a lot of people, that's their argument back to me. Well, that's fine. Yeah, I may be a workaholic, but I love my work, so it's fine, right? Almost every single person I interviewed for the book that were struggling with workaholism, and every single one of them, by the way, had at some point negative health outcomes or negative relationship outcomes or both. And I can't think of a single person that said that they don't love their work. So I think that's with anything to the extreme, it can be a negative, even being intrinsically motivated, by the way.
Yeah. So how do we unpack that? Like, I had heard of intrinsic, I've heard of extrinsic. I've researched and spoken about both of those. I had never heard of introjected motivation. And yet it seemed like maybe the most common form. Like, it just seemed like something, or at least something that we all share, right? We all had societal norms. Our parents are raising us certain ways. They have certain values. If we grew up in certain religions, like there are things that get put on us through childhood, everybody.
Yeah.
And a lot of us never shed those, even though they never felt authentic to us. So what recommendations do you have for people to start to suss out whether it's introjected motivation or whether it's intrinsic motivation? And then how do they process and reconcile that?
Yeah. So I think given that the positive effects of intrinsic motivation can almost be washed out I think we can kind of set that to the side for a minute and just focus on, do I identify with some of these workaholic tendencies? And in the book, I do have a couple questionnaires, self-assessments that you can fill out. One is a measure that I developed and published. Another is the 20 questions from Workaholics Anonymous. So they're both in the book. You can take both of them and just see what you relate to. But, I think 4 simple questions kind of get at these dimensions of motivation. Do I feel like I ought to be working all the time? Do I feel negative emotions when I'm not working, such as anxious or guilt? Do I tend to work more than what is required, doing things like taking work on vacations or finding it difficult to take breaks? And finally, do I think about work all the time? Is work always on my mind, even when it shouldn't be? So I think just reflecting on those 4 questions can give you a really good sense. And if you identify with all of those, you probably are a workaholic. And if you identify with some of those, that still is something to think about, because each one of those dimensions individually has been linked to negative outcomes. So like the cognitive component, if that's the only thing you relate to, well, guess what? Rumination has been linked to inability to psychologically detach from work when you're not at work. And that is necessary for recovery so that you come back to work engaged the next day. So each one of those individually, if you identify with those, you may want to start thinking about how you could make some changes in your life to address that.
Yeah, I identify with a few of those. Just one thing, other people who've listened to the show have heard me talk about this, but I work with a coach from a company called Built to Lead out of Columbus, Ohio. And I've been working with them in a group setting for a long time, have been working with them one-on-one for about 7 or 8 months now. And one of the core exercises that you do there, and you do it in the beginning and then you rinse it over and over and over again, kind of nonstop, is building what they call your core. And one of the core exercises is filling in the blank, I believe blank, as many times as you can. And part of that is filling it out around work too. What are your beliefs around work? And it's an interesting exercise for folks who are curious, hey, have these beliefs been put on me, or is this really who I am? It feels like I'm working a lot. Feels like this workaholism stuff kind of resonates. I answered yes to a few of those questions. Just write out as many statements as you can. I believe blank about work, why you should work, how you should work, the importance of work, the type of work you love to do, and then give it a second, right? Give it a week or 2 and go back and look back through it and say like, okay, which of these is my gut just like, yes, 100%. And which are you like, well, I don't know. And if you write it all down, it helps you articulate it. And then 2, if you give it time and go back, it gives you a fresh perspective to look at your own ideas, which is something we don't get if we don't put it down on paper. So I have found that exercise to be incredibly valuable, and just want to share that with folks because it does help you look at introjected motivations. I have found there have been things where I'm like, yeah, that's not really me. It's not really what I believe. And then I can go back and redefine it for myself.
I love that. I'm going to have to try that too. Thank you.
There you go. So let's talk about the health outcomes then, and relationship outcomes, just really any of the outcomes that you see from workaholism. Because I think people are like, yeah, I know stress goes up. Stress is bad. I get it. I got a lot to do. I'm moving on. But like, can you talk to the actual outcomes that you see from people?
Yeah. So the research is very clear that workaholics tend to experience a variety of increased risk outcomes for things like cardiovascular risk. A lot of people I interviewed had more than one heart attack in their lives. Things like having trouble sleeping is a very common health outcome of workaholism, probably from like the rumination component, largely. But, I think broadly speaking, if our bodies are always feeling like we should go, what's happening physiologically is that our bodies are always in fight or flight. which is great in a crisis, right? It's necessary for survival. But that increased cortisol level, increased heart rate, your body is preparing for a crisis. But if everything is always a crisis and everything is always urgent, then that continued strain on our bodies from being in that fight or flight, that has what has been linked to some of these negative health outcomes. Another thing that I was surprised to learn through my research and through the interviews was that inflammation is a very common outcome of continued strain on the body. And so inflammation, that can be linked to increased risk of cancer and other autoimmune diseases. The list goes on and on. You would be amazed all the stories that I heard, heartbreaking too. And a lot of the people that I interviewed didn't want to stop working, but at some point, many of them were kind of forced to because their body simply just gave out. It couldn't take it anymore. So not only just the constant fight or flight response, but it's also lack of recovery exercises. There's a lot of really great research in the recovery literature on why it's so important to recover from work after we leave work so that we can be productive and engage the next day. And so workaholics tend to not engage in really any of these recovery strategies. The rest and recovery strategies help us to get back to baseline. That is helpful so that we can deal with stress the next day. But if we don't get back to baseline, we never reset. And it's that constant strain on the body, that constant sense of fight or flight that really over time leads to many, many negative health outcomes. And you mentioned relationship outcomes or consequences for the family. And my research lab interviewed over 50 spouses of workaholics as part of a research study. The interviews were just heart-wrenching. Some of my research assistants said, gosh, I feel like a marriage counselor because I can't tell you how many people have just gone on rants about how awful their marriage was. And a couple of even said they were contemplating divorce and just really hard stuff, especially for undergrad research assistants to hear. But just the toll that it takes on the relationship, the negative effects on the kids. I mean, just stories of kids that when their parent is around, they're fighting for their attention. So there's almost like this competition amongst the kids who gets, daddy or mommy's attention when they are there. Or the spouse is saying they might be physically present, but they're just not there. They're not focusing on their family. They're constantly distracted.
How influential is just the fact that we have smartphones with all the access and apps and technology that are trying to drive our time? Because I was thinking that when I was reading that section of the book too, and I'm guilty of this. It's something I'm working on. My wife and I talk about this all the time. Is like, it is addicting to have a phone in your pocket and to, like put my kids to bed and to walk downstairs. And almost every time, by the time I hit the bottom of the stairs, I have my phone in my hand. I'm just like, without thinking about it, I have it in my hand. And it like, there's that addiction too. And I think the two together become, I don't know, like dangerous might be too big of a word, but harmful to your children for sure. And to relationships.
Right. So, I mean, regardless of workaholism, I think just technology and us being kind of always tethered to work through our phones is really problematic. It doesn't allow us to disengage. And I am so guilty of this too. I still have my work email on my phone, which I know I shouldn't, but that makes it even easier to check my work email in the evenings, on the weekends. I still, even though I know it's not good, I can't bring myself to take it off quite yet. I do a better job of putting my phone away when I'm trying to focus on things, like when I'm at my kid's soccer game or, when I am having dinner with my family. But I think just the temptation to just get on and check something just for a minute, it can snowball into, well, that was 30 minutes.
It's never a minute. It's never
You're
a
like,
minute.
oh, and now I have to respond to this email that now something work related came up, and now I have to deal with it. And it definitely is a slippery slope. And they know it too, that, that's partly.
Well, they're designing it that way.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not good.
The Social Dilemma.
Still dealing
for
with
anybody who hasn't seen The Social Dilemma, go watch that.
Oh, I know.
They're pretty open about the fact that they're trying to make it as addicting as possible.
Yeah. And I worry that for like my kids, again, they're both in high school. I worry that it's going to be even worse for them when they are in the workforce, just because I see how all the kids that are that age are so addicted to their phones, just in general.
Yeah. Well, let's talk. You had mentioned in your book the term working light. And that's we're kind of touching on that a little bit. Can you explain what working light is and why you're not a fan of it? I feel like you've kind of done that, but I just want to make that point.
Yeah. So I love this term, and I can definitely relate. And it's something that I struggle with. But working light is related to that behavioral component of workaholism, where we have a hard time stopping work, and we kind of bring work into everything that we're doing. So working light is this idea that when we are not on the clock, right? So whether it's in the evenings or the weekends, we might sneak work in. And what I mean by that is, for example, say, you're in the evening, you're on the couch, you're watching a TV show, and you just kind of grab your laptop and are like, well, I'll just, handle a couple emails while I'm watching this show. I'm still enjoying the show, but what you're doing is you're working light. You're kind of sneaking work in and not fully enjoying whatever it is that you're doing. Another woman I interviewed said she would pour herself a glass of wine, because if she was drinking a glass of wine, then it wasn't like
then it's not
real work, So that's just another example of working light. And the problem is you're still working, right?
Yeah.
You're not fully engaged in whatever else you're supposed to be doing, or whatever else you want to be doing at the moment. So it's always kind of there a little bit.
And why is that bad?
Again, it's that you're not disengaging. You're, part of recovering from work is taking that break, because if you're answering work emails or working on some project, you're thinking about work. You are still doing work and you're still thinking about work. And in order to recover, you can't be doing any of those things, really. And so the recovery is, again, really important to get back to baseline. And it's necessary for going into work the next day and feeling energized and rested and kind of ready to go.
Okay. And so you've also been kind of talking here about taking email off your phone, which is interesting. I will admit, I had never even thought of that. I was like, well, we can't do that. But it was interesting. As you were saying it, I was like, could I do that? I don't know. People are trying to get in touch with me. There's sales opportunities you don't want to miss out. But yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to wrestle with that one after we're done. But one of the things that you talk about is breaking the cycle of responsiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's such a big part of this, right? Is like, well, if somebody emails me and I don't have my phone, I don't have email on my phone, they're going to be mad, right? They're going to be, something bad is going to happen. And in some cases, yeah, like, we all know horror stories of the boss or the client or whoever who's, they'll send you an email at 3:30 in the afternoon. If you haven't responded by 4:30, they're emailing you again. If you haven't responded by 5:30, they're calling you, texting you like, hey, I need this by the morning. Like we all know of or have worked with those people before.
Mm-hmm.
How do we break this cycle of responsiveness? Like what help us, please give us tips. What do you got?
Oh, there's so many layers to that. And I don't have all the answers, that's for sure. Well, cell phones have made it so it is expected that people are going to immediately respond to emails. And it's kind of common knowledge that most people have smartphones and so have the ability to check their email. And like you said, might be irritated if there's not a response right away, or if, you had a pattern of always being responsive and then decide, well, I'm going to put my phone away tonight. It's unusual. It's not your normal behavior, right? So with the cycle of responsiveness, Leslie Perlow talks about this in her book, Sleeping with Your Smartphone, which is a really great title. Love that book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it talks about how smartphones have basically, made it so we are more available and people know it. And because we know people know it, then we tend to respond quickly to messages. And then people come to expect that quick response. And so then they do that more. They contact you more. And then the more they contact you, the more you check it. And then it's like, it's a circle, it's definitely, it just
suddenly we're getting back to everybody in less than 5 minutes.
Right. Exactly. And if that's the norm in your work team or your company, then, if you don't respond, then someone else might respond. And that could have some ramifications for you at work, seeming not as invested in the project or not as good of a worker, quote unquote. And so there's this pressure that you feel, not just from yourself, but also maybe because that's the norm and your boss expects it. And this is what is rewarded at your work. And so there's multiple layers. It's not just that cell phones make us more accessible. It's that they've changed the patterns of communication with our work groups, with our supervisors, with our coworkers. And in my opinion, COVID has made that worse because when a lot of, when COVID hit and a lot of jobs moved fully remote and, people were not seeing each other on a day-to-day basis, we became even more reliant on cell phones and technology to communicate with each other. It was bad before. In my opinion, it's even worse because during COVID, we picked up even more bad habits and it became even more normalized to respond at odd hours of the day.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for that was a practical matter of during COVID, if you had young kids, you were probably homeschooling them during the day because they weren't in school. So you were doing all this stuff. So you had to catch up at night, right? So then again, it became more of a pattern of responding in the evenings when maybe you weren't doing that as much before, but you kind of were forced to during COVID. And then did the pattern of responding late in the evening or odd hours, did that continue after the pandemic was done? And for a lot of people, what I'm hearing is that it kind of just continued, right?
Yeah.
We didn't go back to the way it was.
Yeah, no, definitely not. And I felt it for myself. It took a long time to break the patterns that we had gotten into over COVID. We had a second child in the middle of the pandemic. My wife really struggles when she's pregnant. So she was very sick. I was very hands-on with our older son.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of times where I was being pulled into the house to do things that I was not doing prior when I was out at the office. And,
right. Yep.
Great. It was great to be able to do that. I loved being able to spend that time with my son. I loved being able to be there for my wife. But then as the world shifted back, I found there was a ton of stress and angst trying to break that and get back into whatever this next cycle is going to look like. And, we were able to do it eventually. And we're in some ways still kind of working through that because you're always evolving. But I think that's what created a lot of angst was people got into these new patterns and then suddenly they weren't willing to face the discomfort of breaking those patterns. But those patterns were based on living in your house all the time, which is not a healthy, thriving way to live. And I think that's anyway. That's a whole separate conversation. But we've seen a weird reaction to that, where people got used to living this way for a year or more and wanted to stay there, even though it wasn't healthy for them.
Right. Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. The silver lining was some of the things you were talking about, being there for your wife, spending that quality time with your kids. But yeah, I mean, I think the downside is just the changing work patterns in how and when we communicate with each other. Really, there needs to be a frank conversation with a lot of organizations about when is acceptable for people to be reaching out to each other. Is it really a crisis that needs a 9 o'clock text, or can it wait till the next day? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, we had a lot of sessions a year ago in the first quarter of 2023 around burnout with our associates. And we had leaders getting on the line to say, hey, you do not have to respond all the time. And here's what good service looks like. And here's what above and beyond and kind of unnecessary looks like. And you don't need to go into unnecessary just to prove that you're a good worker. Like, we know you're a good worker. Here's the standard. It's a high standard. Meet the standard, and then go and enjoy your lives. And that's important, because we were seeing people burn themselves out because our clients were a lot more demanding. To your point, they were working many more hours. And so, we saw that having taking a big mental toll on our employees. And facing the Great Resignation last year, we were like, we need to make sure everybody feels really good about working here. And it was really hard for people to set those boundaries. And in many ways, we're still talking about it. It's these are conversations you always need to reinforce.
And it's hard with sales because, especially if you're largely commission based. And I agree with you, customers and clients probably got used to this increased connectivity as well, and maybe got a little spoiled and think, well, we can just continue to do this. But they're getting it from their executives, and it just gets pushed down and down and down. Right.
I talked to a lot of my clients, and they're like, I'm overwhelmed right now. And we're having conversations in our business because historically it's been, hey, come in and help us build a strategy to solve these problems. And now it's like, we don't have time to build the strategy. We need you to come in and tell us what we need to know and tell us where we should be going.
Yeah.
Because they're just so overwhelmed. Everybody's overwhelmed. And I think,
I definitely get that sense too. I feel it. I feel like everyone around me feels the same way. That's the problem, because if it's almost like you're operating in crisis mode all the time. And so it's like, you're this panicked and frantic way of going about working is detrimental, because then you can't focus on the big picture, the priorities, the things that, they might not be the things on fire in the moment, but they're the things that are going to sustain the company in the long run. And so, it's complicated. I think in some of the hard driving cultures, even little changes can make a big impact. I was really struck by some of the research that a group did at Boston Consulting Group. It really just was implementing a small change that made pretty big impacts on the consultants. And that was a mandate that one night a week, one evening, each employee would not be connected to work. So they were not allowed to email. They weren't supposed to respond to clients and all of that. Just one evening a week. Consulting is very similar to sales, where you kind of always have to be on. But, with cross training and kind of relying on your teammates to kind of handle if something does come up, but implementing that forced time off. And it was just one evening a week, which a lot of people might be like, oh, that's not even a big deal. But in that company, it really was. It was a big change, and it was a big obstacle, and there was some pushback, but people realized for the most part, it was really loved by the end of the trial. People were like, oh, I really liked just being able to hang out with my family and not feeling like something could interrupt that at any minute.
Yeah.
So rotating that one evening a week, time off.
Yeah, it's wild that something like that can get so much pushback. Hey, enjoy one night a week.
I know.
I don't know about that,
Yeah.
Like the world's going to fall apart. I think that's the other thing is the world's not going to fall apart. The world's going to be fine. There might be one time a year, maybe, where there's an actual emergency. There's all this fake urgency that's out there.
Oh, yeah.
Everything feels urgent. But if you actually think about when does this need to get done, not when are they asking for it, but when is it actually needed? It's very rarely is there anything that's truly, truly urgent.
Yeah, but I agree with you. A lot of things can feel urgent.
Yeah.
People are telling you it's urgent, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we get addicted to that. I think you talked about it a little bit before, but I have found that I'll be heads down and work and go. And then I'll stand up and go to the bathroom and I'll be standing there in the restroom. And like, I can feel my heart in my chest pounding, and I'm like, man, it feels like I'm working out. Like, what is going on? And it is this, it's almost like a runner's high. That's kind of what I've been thinking about is like, when we say we like work, often we like that feeling we get. It's kind of those endorphins that kick in because we're running on adrenaline all the time.
Right.
But that has some very, very serious health consequences down the line. Yeah.
And that is another thing that a lot of the people I interviewed mentioned as well, was almost like being addicted to the adrenaline. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, it feels good to be on, to be in it, to be mixing it up, right?
It's exciting.
Yeah. You're needed. It's urgent. But in reality, it's not. It's just us making ourselves feel good.
Yeah.
I want to pause and circle back to something that you kind of touched on at the beginning. And it's this existential guilt or anxiety when we're not working. And I think in all of what I read in the book, like that seems to be the thing. Whether you're working 100 hours or you're working 40 hours, doesn't seem to matter as much as when you're not working. Are you gripped so tight with this guilt or anxiety that you should be doing more? And there seems to be, like, culturally, there's, you can just go on YouTube or Instagram or whatever, and there's all these people talking about memento mori. We're all going to die and we've got this one life to live. And I've bought into that a lot, right? Like I am not thrilled that this ride's going to end at some point, and I'm trying to get as much out of this as I can. But there is a point where that just becomes so unhealthy, and you can just sit there and obsess about the fact that you need to cram as much into every minute as you can. Oh, I'm just sitting on the couch, not doing anything. I should be filling this time with something productive. How do we break that? How do we get rid of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think what you said about society, we still worship this ideal worker of someone who's prioritizing the company, always there 24/7. It's difficult if you see yourself as a successful professional to not totally just buy into that, feel like this is what you should be doing. And I struggle with that too, always needing to be doing something, always needing to fill that space, not wanting to feel like I'm wasting time. Something that has worked for me is if I'm trying to disengage from work, but I also hate doing nothing, is to fill the space with something else that takes my mind off of work and kind of forces me to focus on it. It's one of those recovery experiences that I've mentioned earlier. Specifically, it's called a mastery experience. And
so what would an example of that be?
Yeah, so it's really anything that, again, requires your focus, that you need to concentrate on it. So this could be learning a new language, for example, or it could be learning a new skill. My graduate student, got into woodworking, and now he builds all of this really amazing furniture. And so that requires reading books or looking at YouTube videos and then actually trial and error with doing that. It could be learning how to play an instrument, that kind of thing. So I'm a researcher. I like doing that, but I recognize that I don't need to constantly be doing work-related research. So, my mastery experience is related to travel. I'm also very frugal, so I try to find ways to travel on the cheap. So I do points and miles and travel hacking, if you will. But there is a lot of skill to that. And so you need to do a lot of research. So that's kind of where I put my energy. If I'm realizing that I need to take a break from work, but I don't really just want to be sitting around because I know that I'll be tempted to just pull out my laptop and start doing work stuff. I do this other mastery experience, and it helps me to psychologically disengage from work, but still feed my constant need to be busy almost. So, I would say perhaps look for some sort of mastery experience that you can focus on. What are your passions outside of work? Is there something that you've always wanted to do, but didn't really feel like you had the time? Well, you could purposefully do it as, an intentional recovery strategy. And mastery experiences have been shown with the research to be extremely beneficial for things like work engagement and just getting that rest that your body needs.
It feels like there's a caveat that needs to be said to that for me, because this is personally now what I can do is I enjoy writing on the side. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned, I had a children's book come out last year, and it's great and it's fun. And yet if I let it, it's like, oh, great, I'm going to write this new novel. And now I got to write this many words every night. And now it becomes work. And now I'm anxious or feel guilty that I've not gotten my words in, that I've not done this thing. And so like mastery, I was reading the mastery exercise thing and I was like, great, this really interesting. I'm glad that this is recovery. Mm-hmm. But I think you can, like a workaholic can also turn it into take a good thing and ruin it.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a balance here that just needs to be mentioned for people who are workaholics.
Yeah, that's a really important caveat because anything to the extreme can be negative. If exercise is your recovery strategy, you can take that to the extreme and it can become unhealthy. With anything, I was interviewing this one woman. She's a therapist and her side passion was with this pilot for a TV series that was related to therapy, but she was helping with the script of this show. She ended up realizing that she was spending more time on that passion project than her actual work. And the two combined, she was working crazy hours, right? So she was trying to do something different, although in that case, it was still a little bit related to her work, but it was becoming just as big of a problem for her. Yeah. And I find the same thing too, with planning a trip, I can go way overboard with all the details. And I catch myself doing that. Like, I need to research every little thing about this town and what I need to do when I'm there and this and that. And then I'm like, this is getting to the point of being obsessive. I need to curb that a little bit. So I think mastery experiences also can be problematic. Recognizing that if you do have these sort of tendencies to be obsessive about things, to just try to recognize that this can be with anything and not just work.
Yeah. Last thing, I know we're almost out of time, but I realize there's one more sort of myth that I want to dispel here. And that is if there's a boss sitting there yeah, but I want my people to be workaholics. Mm-hmm. Like I want them to be hyper productive. I want them to come in and just commit their whole lives to this thing. Like then we're going to outcompete everybody else. Can you talk about that and maybe dispel that myth?
Yeah. I think that is a really pervasive myth that just won't go away. This idea that if people are workaholics, they're going to be super productive and they're going to help the bottom line. And of course, we would want this, right? It's the way things have been done. But there are so many downsides and really hardly any upsides, maybe a temporary upside of, yeah, people seem really motivated in the moment and they're doing lots of work for me right now. But there's always going to be a point where the employee can't sustain it anymore, whether it's burnout or physical consequence with all of the negative health outcomes. It will catch up to people, but also workaholics tend to always be in this crisis mode. And as I mentioned, that's not a good environment to be operating in, dealing with a day-to-day crisis and panic. Organizations need to be thinking about, the strategy, the big picture, the really broad problems, and not just putting out these little fires everywhere.
Yeah.
Also, it can create some negative environments amongst coworkers or between bosses and employees, overextending the team, overcommitting, fostering this competitive environment where people are trying to one up each other and show that they're the most dedicated because they're working long hours. The research is clear. There is no relationship in the research between workaholism and performance. I conducted a meta-analysis, which is, compiling all the research, looking at this, and it was like nil. There was nothing, no relationship.
Well, no, not even no relationship, but a negative relationship from what I read, right? Like, the people who work the longest hours perform, maybe not the worst, but they don't perform the best. They're not your top performers.
Right. I mean, there's an economist that ran a whole bunch of models, and really any work over about 55 hours a week is not going to help you at all. And someone that's working 70 hours a week is just as productive as someone who's working 55. It's almost like this inverted U that at a certain point, like you said, you become less and less productive the more hours you're spending. And it's because of really needing this recovery to get back to baseline. Think about, your energy levels when you start work at the beginning of the day compared to after a super long day and you're trying to focus on something that takes a lot of mental energy. I know for me, it's like I get to that point in the afternoon where I'm like, I cannot do this. I'm just not going to be able to focus. Yeah. And so it's that same kind of phenomenon where we just can't continue to go and be as productive, so.
Yeah, because then now you're stacking that feeling. Now you're showing up to work with that feeling because you didn't get the recovery. And like every day it gets a little bit worse. And maybe you recover over the weekends, but maybe not. Maybe you work hard, play hard, and you go out and party your face off. Or, or you drink a little too much even at home. And then now you're really not recovered. Now you show up again and it's just, you're never, I think there's a baseline of people out there that have just not been feeling good or performing well for so many years that they just assume that that's what good performance looks like. And I think we've just accepted a lot of bad habits and behavior. I don't want to sound like, some old man like, well, you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. We should all enjoy our lives. But I think we've sort of adopted or accepted this version of like mild alcoholism as kind of the norm, or this mild workaholism as the norm. And I don't think that that's really what it means to be thriving.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Some pushback could be like, well, that back in my day, that's what everyone did to show they were hard workers. But we know a lot more now than we did about just the detrimental effects that it takes on people and companies.
Yeah.
Think of the increased healthcare costs that companies are paying, talk about the bottom line. Yeah, the health and well-being of your workforce is critical to the bottom line.
Yeah, well, that's what I do for work is we help companies put together their benefits, their wellness plans, anything to do with their total rewards. And it is a hard conversation to bring up as a consultant to come in and who's there to help about insurance and rising healthcare costs, it's hard to get executives to look at, well, what's the culture like here? And what's the environment that your people are showing up to every day? Do they feel good about that environment?
Right.
It's like, well, what does that have to do with it? Like, how do we keep our healthcare trend down? And I think the two are very related. And you had even said in the book, you had quoted, the workplace is the 5th leading cause of death in America, which I thought was astounding.
Yeah, it really is something that there have been more conversations about employee wellness, especially coming out of the pandemic. I hope it continues. I hope it's not just lip service either.
Melissa, we are at time here. And I know I said at the beginning that I could go on and ask you a lot of questions and turn this into a therapy session. Hopefully I haven't done that too much, but this is really, really interesting. Final question. Obviously, if people want to learn more about this, they can get the book, Never Not Working. Where else can they find you? And what 1 or 2 recommendations do you have for people as a starting point if they're like, man, I need some help?
Well, they can find me. Probably the easiest would be my website, melissaclark.com. It's spelled Malissa, a little bit different. And a couple tips. Yeah, I mean, I think just reflecting on what are your own tendencies towards work and trying to just make 1 or 2 tweaks to how you're doing things as a start, whether it's implementing your own 1 night a week off or making a point to not send emails to your work team in the evening and instead use schedule send. That's a big one too, to break that cycle of responsiveness. So maybe just make a couple tweaks and realize that, we're all work in progress. We're not perfect. I think just little changes can make a big difference. And if you're finding that it's really improving your well-being to take these couple steps, just continue that. And also, if you're a leader, think about how you can tweak some things about how you manage your work team to help employees that maybe don't want to help themselves or don't really see that they have a problem, but maybe your company or your team does have some workaholic tendencies. And so how can you make some changes? Got to start somewhere, basically.
Yeah. Well, I love that. To everybody listening, good luck out there. Hope this helps you rein in your work a little bit and do it in a way that comes from an intrinsic place and feels real good and allows you to enjoy the rest of your lives. Melissa, thank you. Wish you all the best with the success of the book and wish everybody out there health and well-being as you manage work and life.
Thank you.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.